Welcome back to History 1301. Today's lecture is on colonialism, expansion, and its costs. So we're going to be looking over how these colonies developed between the year 1660 through 1700. So after Columbus's voyage of 1482, Portugal and Spain sent out thousands of adventurers and settlers to the New World, followed soon after by colonists from France, Holland, and England. All of them encountered uncertainty and danger, and the experiment of colonizing the New World was never really certain. At any moment, conflict with the natives, poor adaptability to the environment, or even tension with the European nations could have ended in, the entire colonizing effort. But after a while, life in the colonies settled down, and the colonials found many advantages to living in the New World. There was greater opportunities that existed for most people, and most hoped to eventually own their own land, marry, and even raise families. As we can see, colonial life did become easier. People ended up living longer, they gave birth to more children, and were generally healthier than they had been the early years of settlement. But while the colonials might be forming a distinct American identity, they brought along much of their cultural baggage too. Social hierarchies existed in the colonies, though to a lesser extent than they had in Europe. People of the lower classes still deferred to their betters, but unlike in Europe, those of a lower birth who illustrated great or rare qualities, like men like John Smith, for example, could rise through the ranks to positions of power, wealth, or even prominence. A potential for social mobility existed in the colonies that did not exist in Europe. Colonial women's status differed from European women. At first, there was an acute shortage of women in the colonies that made them even more highly valued. The less women in the settlement, the better they were treated. Despite this, married colonial women had no political or legal rights, although single and widowed women did. By necessity, though, women worked, sharing in the family economy. Everyone needed to work together to survive, and although the 13 English colonies shared many things in common, geography and climate, in particular, soon created conditions that made 4 distinct differences. Let's talk about the middle colonies, which are also known as a mosaic of nationalities and religions. The primary axiom of the 17th century stated that strong church was a mainstay of civic stability. The church instilled moral behavior, respect for authority, and created better citizens. The government depended on the church and protected its existence in a reciprocal relationship. Even one of the early English colonies established a single church, state-sanctioned and aided by local government through taxes and privileges. The colonies, whether they were southern like Jamestown or northern like Plymouth, dictated national and religious exclusionism because the leaders believed that exclusionary behavior was best for all settlers. If everyone practiced the same religion, there would be no religious persecution. In turn, this implied that everyone would follow the same civic pattern. The colony would be homogeneous, with no religion or civic disagreements. It is odd, then, that the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, became the stage for the Western world's most complex experiment with national and religious pluralism, or the toleration of multiple nationalities and faith. Those who fled to the middle colonies of the New World included Dutch Mennonites, French Huguenots, German Baptists, Portuguese Jews, Dutch Reformed, Lutherans, and Quakers, and even Anglicans who were already living there. Mixed in the indigenous natives and the African slaves with their own, religious practices, and the middle colonies became a mosaic of nationalities and religions. So because of this, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania originated as proprietary colonies, meaning that the king gave the colony to one or more people who controlled the land and held extensive powers of government over it. New York specifically, it originally was settled by the Dutch, and they called it New Netherland. English settlers conquered the settlement in 1664, and New York City became the port of entry for people of all nationalities, all of whom lived together in the city. For example, in a census that was taken in 1770, out of a population of 22,000 people, there were 18 different churches, 3 Dutch Reformed, 3 Anglican, 3 Presbyterian, 2 Lutheran, 1 French Huguenot, 1 Congregational, 1 Methodist, 1 Baptist, 1 Quaker, 1 Moravian, and 1 Jewish temple. So this is just to give you an example of how very mixed the society was. And this is part of the reason why the middle colonies in particular are known as the most tolerant of all, or because they are made up of people from all different types of religious backgrounds and nationalities. When it comes to the New England colonies, religion defined the colonies as much as, its climate and its geography. Settlers in Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were Puritan. Religion dictated everyday life and permeated the lives of northern colonials, exercising a pervasive influence over the people. In most colonies, the church and state remained one, controlling many aspects of life and even creating great social strains. Towns anchored northern colonial life, villages formed around the church, and a central green area where all important businesses and communities' activities occurred. Houses clustered around the center, radiating out into, concentric circles with fields out in the outlying areas. Community involvement and activity became a central feature of life in these colonies. These northern colonies included New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. In the New England colonies, the healthy northern climate encouraged far longer lifespans that existed in the South. Both men and women in the North were expected to live, on average, into their 70s. Arranged marriages prevailed in the North, in part because there was a rough balance in the number of men and women living in the area. Once families formed, they worked together to prosper. Husbands and wives formed teams of production with children, adding to the number of workers. But with all of this religious and social pressure, there was a lot of strains in these northern colonies as well. With the increasing population and the economy that developed in the Atlantic region of the New England colonies, these social pressures put a lot of strain on the religious piety envisioned by John Winthrop and the first Puritan settlers. After 1640, the population grew faster than church membership, though everyone was forced to attend church or suffer fines or punishment. Worse, the children of saints were not experiencing their own conversion moments and seeking membership in the church. As the situation worsened over time, Puritan church leaders debated, deciding to allow the unconverted children of saints to become halfway church members under the halfway covenant. This way, saints could baptize their infants and ensure that the children were protected against the terrors of death and hell. One of the biggest problems that's attributed to all of these social pressures and, religious piety comes in the form of the Salem witchcraft trials. It's no secret that most people believed in witchcraft, and Europe experienced periodic witch hunts during the same time period. Prior to the episode in Salem, however, almost 300 New Englanders, mostly middle-aged women, had been accused of practicing witchcraft, and more than 30 of them had been hanged. But the episode in Salem was far more intense than any other witch hunt in North America. During the winter of 1691 to 1692, several girls between the ages of 9 and 20 accused 3 local women of practicing witchcraft. The girls had violent fits and claimed to experience hearing and sight loss, as well as choking sensations and a loss of appetite, claiming it was because of some of the local women were witches. Now, prior to this, the girls had been spending long evenings with a West Indian slave woman named Tituba, who often spoke of supernatural and engaged the girls in fortune-telling games. Now, the girls eventually accused her of making an agreement with the devil and issuing witchcraft to harm them. Tituba went on to name other women in the community, arguing that they had caused her harm to the girls. Soon the accusations spread, and within the year, 19 people had been hanged. One man pressed to death by heavy stones, and more than 100 others jailed. Eventually, more than 200 people were accused. The hysteria snowballed into a complete crisis. Courts pressured the accused to confess to witchcraft and implicate others. Suspects who played their innocence did so only to get out of, jail, essentially. But they had to name names. Even some of the community members stood up for the witnesses as to the good character, but it was too late. There was too much paranoia that had overtaken the village, and people were accusing each other left and right. Eventually, what ended up happening is the court ordered public hangings on Gallows Hill. And finally, when the accusations began to be made against the richer, more affluent families like that of the governor, that's when the accusations stopped. And, people were trying to make sense of it. Some blamed the devil for their false accusations. But the question is, why did the trials occur at Salem? Historians originally thought that the local feuds and property disputes had been a reason for tearing apart the town of Salem proper and Salem village. More recently, though, historians have questioned why the majority of the accused were women, and they have even determined that these women had in some way defied the traditional roles assigned to females. Some of these girls worked outside the home. Some of them were poor or were widowed, without any protection in the community, without anybody to defend them. Some of the accused didn't attend church, while others were just old and unfriendly. And some historians also believe that Salem's village close proximity to fighting against the Indians on the marine frontier could have strained community relations to the breaking point. Others also suspect that rare food poisonings like the fungus of bread or mosquito-borne illnesses could have caused the mass hallucinations. But whatever the cause, no other outbreak of this nature occurred in New England again. Let's talk about how slavery was established in the Western Atlantic world. If we look at the origins of American slavery, right, this is between Englishmen and Africans specifically. What ended up happening here is we have a growing demand for labor for tobacco, right, which was the cash crop in these colonies. And this is going to push these, plantation owners to turn to slaves as a source of labor. Okay. Now, race and racism, this is where it gets sort of dicey, right? It gets intertwined because the English, they saw their slaves as savages or animals and totally uncivilized. Now, previous to the introduction of slavery to the English colonies, it had already existed, since ancient Greece and Rome, even before Europeans started to trade with Africans for slaves. In the Americas, however, slavery was different from ancient times because with the plantation model, right, you have these owners, these single owners that use slavery to as a source of labor, as a source, to generate their wealth. And that is how it became associated with race, specifically in the American colonies. So slavery had already existed in history, but in the American colonies is where in the American colonies, it is where slavery became associated with the African race. Now, the reasons behind the expansion of slavery in the American colonies has a lot to do with the expansion of trade routes between Europe and Africa, right? What we're starting to see here that's different in the early years of these colonies is that slaves were more expensive to buy earlier on. But as more and more trade is taking place and those trade routes are expanding, the number of slaves is increasing. The number of slaves that are available is increasing and also making them less expensive. In fact, more affordable, if, for lack of a better word. Now, where we start to see the transition from indentured servants, which were, English and Irish poor, to African slavery, has a lot to do with Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, so what ends up happening in Jamestown is there's this revolt led by Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon is an indentured servant, right? He doesn't own land. He doesn't have any rights. And him and 6,000 other indentured servants plus 2,000 slaves are essentially going to petition Governor Berkeley to change his policies, to be more decisive. They don't think that the governor is doing enough to protect them against Native American attacks. And, he even tries to press the governor to, let him and his men go out and, to defend themselves against Native Americans. But Berkeley doesn't want to do that. He's unwilling to listen to Bacon. He's unwilling to, in part because Bacon's a nobody, right? He is an indentured servant. And so this is where a lot of those tensions come from. Bacon and his men here, they don't think that the governor is doing enough to protect them. They don't think that his policies are progressive enough. And so, they essentially threaten violence, and all of this leads to the burning of Jamestown. Now, eventually, this gets the attention of the governor, and they do pass Bacon's laws, which ended up, democratizing the politics in Virginia. But the reason why Bacon's Rebellion is significant is for these three right here. Their willingness to use violence to get what they want, because of land lust, because they want to own land so badly that they're willing to threaten their lives, they're willing to threaten private property, is going to leave a very ugly taste in the mouths of these people. Because remember, they've been depending on indentured servants to work the fields, right? They pay their passage to bring them here. They work for 7 years or whatever, and then they get a little piece of land. But the problem is that now these indentured servants are getting so problematic to the point where it's making these landowners question whether they should continue bringing indentured servants or, Englishmen to continue working in the colonies when they are willing to use violence as a tool to get what they want, when they feel that things are not going their way. So this is one of the major reasons why we see a rise of slavery. The indentured servants' lust for land and also their willingness to use violence to destroy private property and public property is what causes a significant shift towards an expansion of slavery in the American colonies. Remember, it used to be that indentured servants were cheaper than African slaves because there wasn't enough African slaves. They were very, very expensive. And so if this is a business and we're talking about labor, it doesn't make any sense to have that huge expense in the beginning. And so it just ended up that it was cheaper, more affordable, and just a better deal to bring indentured servants. Because remember, some of them didn't survive to the end of their contract term. But there's problems also beyond that with indentured servants because these guys, they could blend in with other Europeans. They could change their name. It's not like, there was IDs or fingerprinting or anything like that. You pay for them to come here, expecting them to work for you for 7 years, and they could just as easily run away and escape and squat in some, piece of land, and no one would be the wiser. Now, as time went on as well, that's the other thing too is they're starting to survive. They're making it out of their seasoning period, and their 7 years is up. They've fulfilled their contract, and now they're expecting to be paid with a piece of land of their own. So you paid for them to come here to work for you for 7 years. And what ends up happening is at the end of those 7 years, now you got to give them a big chunk of your own land and they become your competition. So you can start to see why these landowners, these plantation owners, are not too keen on bringing them to the colonies anymore. So they're looking for an alternative. As trade with these African colonies expanded, more slaves are going to be in the market. They're going to be less expensive than before. We also see numbers of kidnappings and stuff. It's going to become very, very profitable. But as that happens, that's where we start to see the scales tip in favor of using African slaves for labor instead of indentured servants. So consider all of those reasons that we just discussed. It's not, it didn't happen overnight, but it's over time. All of these different factors come together, and this is why we see the transition from indentured servants to African slaves. Now, in 1662, this is where we see the first major law regarding slavery emerge in the English colonies. This law stipulated that the condition of the mother determined the condition of the child. What this means is if the mother is a slave, then the child is a slave. So why would this matter? Well, because what if the child's father is white? What if the landowner, what if he fathered a child with his slave? Whether by rape or, force or anything like that. And if this child is born and looks like a white person, how can we be sure? I mean, there's a lot of gray areas here. So in 1662, this law stated that the condition of the mother determined the condition of the child. And so because of this law, we're going to see a huge jump in the number of slave owners. exploiting that law, exploiting that fact for producing more slaves, even if that means they're producing them themselves. Again, the anti-amalgamation law as well is going to outlaw interracial sex and marriage, and it's enacted in Maryland in 1664. So as we start to see the number of African slaves increase in the English colonies, this is where we start to also see a reflection of these laws being passed that are specific to the slave populations in the colonies, right? These laws have language that make it very clear, about the racial differences between servants and slaves. And it also ensured that the treating of African Americans and Euro Americans was different by the law. It didn't matter, where they come from, because the fact that their status was slaves determined how the law treated them. In addition to this is where we're also seeing the development of slave codes. Now, slave codes are laws that are specific to the slave populations. They basically govern every single aspect of slaves' lives in the colonies, right? It made it very, very difficult for these Africans to live in the colonies as a free person. It declared that all servants that were brought into the region as slaves were property. It guaranteed the slaveholders, permanent ownership. It allowed masters to punish their property without any kind of, consequences. And, an example of a specific slave code, for example, they needed to have permission. They couldn't just simply go from one plantation to another. They needed to have a written document giving that slave permission to leave the plantation. Otherwise, they were fair game. Somebody could scoop them up, somebody could claim them, somebody could kill them. And so again, these slave codes are designed to control the slave population in the American colonies, but we see them more specifically being used in the southern colonies like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, of which South Carolina and Georgia are proprietary colonies. So remember, that means that somebody owns them. They're not like a royal colony or anything like that. Okay, so with that in mind, don't forget to do your discussion. Was it slavery that led to racism, or racism that led to slavery? Give me enough details, right, to give me some substance. And don't forget to comment on at least 2 classmates' posts. That's going to do it all for today. Come back and finish up the lecture on the continued expansion. I mean, we're about to finish this unit already, so I will be posting part 2 of expansion and its cost probably tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. As always, email me if you guys have any questions. I hope you enjoyed our time together. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again real soon. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.